So our third and final presentation for this session is Catherine Bishop. Catherine is a second-year PhD student at Liverpool University, focusing on the use and sustainability of resin in the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. She is a BA in Classical Civilizations and Egyptology from Swansea University and MA at the same institution in Ancient Egyptian Culture. So, welcome to the stage, Catherine, and I will give you the mic, and when you're ready, you can just go right ahead.
There we are, just clip that on. Can everyone hear me now? Yeah. So I'll just give like a very brief overview about what I'm talking, because I understand that everyone's kind of like studying a bit different stuff. So I am looking for this presentation specifically at aromatic vessels, so perfume and incense vessels from the Middle Bronze Age mainly, and the Eastern Mediterranean. So that kind of like includes the Near East as well as Egypt. But first, to kind of like get into this, we have to understand what the value of these aromatics were. And so these were part of everyday life. And olfaction is actually like known to have like shaped human action and human behavior. And in the ancient world, it was widely available from temples and in temples, as well as used in festivals. And so you also get like the quote, which is always like, incense transcends the barrier between life and death, and kind of like these main ideas about its value in the ancient world. And that's seen from as early as the Old Kingdom, looking in the 7 sacred oils. Almost all of those were aromatic, at least to some extent. And so you can really see the impact of the aroma in the ancient world, especially in the religious sphere. And these were not just in the religious sphere, though. They were often used in domestic contexts, and records of this date back to almost every culture that we have textual evidence from. So we have like Greek, Latin, Akkadian, Sumerian, you know, every form of hieroglyphs. We've got texts on aromatics. And research often focuses, despite this like wealth of evidence, research often focuses on frankincense and myrrh. But my research kind of like lends itself to the Eastern Mediterranean, the more accessible stuff, which is used a lot more in Babylon and Egypt on a day-to-day basis. And the day-to-day basis is because of how stinking the ancient world was. So the pungent sense, especially in like the city environments, I put cities in inverted commas. What's a city? And so you get a lot of like smelling from sewage, of course, but a lot from manufacturing, especially like tanning. Any leather works absolutely stinks. And so this backdrop really provides the explanation of why they valued it so much. And of course, these smellscapes varied across Babylon and Egypt. And that kind of provides a reason about why they're using it so differently. So just generally, they're using the same incense, so from the same place, but in massively different ways, which is what I'll be explaining today. So aromatics were stored and distributed using these different vessels. And I'll focus today on the end use, so the perfumes and the incense, instead of like the transportation vessels. And for this research, I've kind of processed around 130 museum catalogues, which I need to cross-reference with Sam to make sure I've got all of the British ones at least. So I'll have to talk with you after. And it's these objects that I base this following presentation on. So Eugene Rimmel, the French-British perfumer from, as you probably guys know, the Rimmel London collection, he makes this very bold statement, which I don't agree with to a certain extent, but you can kind of see through the actual vessels, is the history of perfume is in some manner that of civilization. It's a very bold statement. Don't massively agree, but you can kind of like see the reasoning for it. In every culture, there's this kind of like notion. And it dates back, thousands of years. Even Pliny dedicates these massive sections of his text to perfumes. And he calls it elegant and honorable. And it's these perfumes often use these resins that I'm looking at for my dissertation. And these were mixed with either animal fats or oils. But in ancient Egypt, particularly, few perfumes were actually free-flowing. They're not the perfumes that we know. They are made with like these waxes and these fats. And that, of course, affects what vessels they're used in. So glass, as we see in that slide, glass is the primary material for what was used. And that's because there's no kind of chance for any chemical interaction. It doesn't alter the scent and the aroma of the actual perfume. But it also is pretty. You're able to design it quite nicely. And it was quite available. So polychrome glass was used, because it looks nice and it was quite available at the time. And this is in both Egypt and Babylon. So the other kind of options in the ancient world were, things stone, silver, even wood is documented. And Egyptian examples are usually like travertine or Egyptian alabaster. And any of the wooden examples come from a funerary context. This is because wood is not very good for storing perfume. And so it's mostly like a model instead of actually storing such scents. The glass examples from all the collections I reviewed, the Egyptian ones were highly decorative. So this is the luxurious nature of perfume kind of mirrored on this bottle itself. And you get perfumers such as Francois Coty, who argues that it's necessary for perfume to attract the eyes as much as it attracts the nose. But the interesting thing about this, of like you see in this example, the Egyptian ones are very highly decorative, so there. So I think, one sec, 57% of the Egyptian sample was very highly decorative and done to a good extent, like this one. Whereas only 18% of Near Eastern examples were decorative at all. And when they were, not very nice. And so it's really kind of interesting to compare and contrast those two aspects and try and look at the reasonings for this. Of course, it's really important to note that Egyptian examples of perfume vessels from the museums that I catalogued, we have a lot more Near Eastern a lot more Egyptian examples. And so it's, the survivability of these things and also the things collectors wanted is very different. So it's always important to note that evidence is incomplete and buried, and then we're kind of like bringing in these scattered titles and recipes and this archaeological evidence to provide only a mere glimpse of perfumes in the Bronze Age. But I think the kind of like, I tap out at perfumes at this point. Perfumes isn't what my PhD research is on, because it's messy. It's really difficult to understand the divide of cosmetic and medical and religious when it comes to perfume and aromatics. And so, yeah, this use of perfumes in a religious context is really confusing of what category you put it in and kind of understanding that. And so I focus more on altars and actual senses because we know what they are. So out of the 45 catalogued aromatic burners from Nippur, 31 were the traditional altar type. So the vast majority are. the vast majority of the catalogued ones are from Nippur, but that's just because of the way collections moved around. I think it was the Met had a very good connection when the excavations were going on, so a lot got shipped over there. And only one altar type censer has, in this 130 museum catalogue, I will state, only one altar type was in this bunch from Egypt. And that's probably because of this, cultural interaction, a bit of back and forth, maybe a bit of trading. So this is likely an import or influence by these Near Eastern cultures. But in the Near East, very little change in design. As you see, they're all kind of like square, boxy, and they're sturdy and very recognizable, which helps the records. When they stay in shape and when you can tell what they are, it's always easier to search through. But the interesting part between Egypt and the Near East is these censers and these altars would have held wood, not resins. So as we know, Egyptian incense, it was almost in the form of this resin or this mix. Whereas Near East, it would have been made from wood, just straight up wood, maybe a bit of sulfur on it, get a bit of smoke going. So 91% of Near Eastern examples were made of pottery, and the majority of this is quite coarse, and some were made of stone, but not very many. The feat of this design would have allowed it to get to these really hot temperatures without any scorching. And these are primarily known from ritual and kind of temple contexts. And in the Near East, it's used as a sacred practice. And the designs of these allow for quite a lot of dissemination of aroma, whilst also, especially when sulfur's on it, a lot of smoke going directly up and channeling up. Because there's this idea that, the gods are consuming this incense. And so you're burning something to actually physically see it go up. And that's something that you get a little bit later in Egypt, but not initially. And so in the Near East, they kind of were ahead in that game. So for Egyptian examples, censers, very generic title, they come in a variety of forms, but these are mainly made of pottery. So stone and copper alloy are present, but these stone and copper tend to be from Babylonian contexts more than Egyptian. Bronze censers are very common in tomb art. So that's one of the things I'm currently doing is cataloging the tomb art. And so you get these bronze stick censers. And out of the Theban tombs, I've already catalogued over 400. But in actual museum collections, I've found 2, and these are likely dated to the late period, not to the Middle Bronze Age. But yeah, we have an absolute ton, especially Middle Kingdom, where we don't see other forms of censer. You get a lot of these stick censers, but we don't have them in the archaeological record. So the survivability of these objects plays a large role in this, as well as the reuse of such material. And depictions and models are seen throughout the Middle Kingdom. I need to investigate whether some of these unprovenanced censer sticks are all dated to the late period, but it's whether there's this general assumption that they're from the late period. Reading a lot of the texts, they will say, oh, these were invented in the late period. And you're like, but they're not. You have hundreds of examples of them being shown in the earlier periods. So I need to kind of properly track these down to see whether some of the museum collections can be dated earlier. The 4 main types, no, I've only got pictures of 3. So the 4 main types of censer that I look at is a bowl, cup, a footed type, so a little footed bowl, and then the stick censer. So that's the bronze one, which usually has the little falcon head there. And it's the footed bowl and cup types, interestingly, are all multifunctional offering vessels. So not necessarily strictly incense. I mean, you guys have probably seen a lot more than I have of like, you know, a little bird on the offering tray and on the bowls and things like that. And so going through the catalogs, it's really hard to kind of distinguish what's a cup and what's an offering cup, what's a bowl and what's an offering bowl. And so this data, I have kind of like moved on a little bit, and I'm looking at comparing the visual and archaeological as well as textual because of this unreliability really issue. And it's also a thing of everything can be used as a sensor, including things like little fragments, little bits of glass, whatever's around. So Margaret Surfco did a study on these little fragments that were used as sensors. So that kind of really needs to be taken into consideration whilst looking at this data as well. One thing I will say, there are a lot of random sensors that don't really fit in. So this is just a very quick slide. Here are some funky shapes that don't really fit in anywhere. They're all listed as sensors. They've all got like evidence of resins or aromatics within them. How do they work? What do they look like? Yeah, I'll try and figure it out one day. But generally, just to kind of like loop back, I kind of am comparing the way these two different things are used. So the smellscapes between Babylon and Egypt, one of the major things of a differing kind of presentations is that Babylon uses fresh wood in these square sensors. Sorry. Forgot about that. Babylon uses fresh wood in these altars, but they also make their temples out of these fresh wood. So every time you open the door and close that, you get that waft. Whereas in Egypt, it's very much like you're burning a targeted center that you can walk around a lot more freely rather than just having it on the table, and that's it. And so it's a wide area for scent distribution. And that's always helped with, you know, like offerings and that kind of thing. And perhaps crossing that boundary of when you have these offerings, you know, how like in the iconography, you have this like either like a pillar or the offering table or anything like that. You have this like incense, which you can like push through instead of just like having it on the table and walking away. And so that is one of the ideas that I'm kind of playing with at the moment. Perfumes, I didn't really mention much about that. So in Egypt, they're using animal fats. In Babylon, they are liquid. They're using sesame oil, and they're like imbuing this sesame oil with the fresh woods. Whereas in Egypt, you kind of like crush down the resin, melt it in with the animal fats. And so, yeah, you do very much see these differences. And so I'm kind of gonna try and look a little bit more at that. But for future research, one of the things I'm specifically looking at is the cultural impact and the cultural reasoning for such scents. So they are both personal and cultural. My research will focus further on how this impacted the development of different approaches to aromatic woods, and how, despite times of contacts, ideas and designs often didn't translate. Like if we only have one example of an altar, and Babylon, not even just Babylon, like the entire Near East, I look at, you know, ranging like Syria, Palestine, a lot of it, and they are so different. It's very much like there's a clear divide, and I kind of want to look at why. And so residue analysis is also another area that that is taking place currently, not by me, but it's taking place. And so kind of trying to follow up on these aromatic plants that are rarely encountered in these contexts. The changeable nature of aromatic compounds over these thousands of years. Analysis is often a little bit finicky. And so that is one of the things I kind of need to keep up to date with and follow that through. And so yeah, the next slide is just a little bit of a bibliography, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. I have tons of questions for this because this is not my topic at all, but I hope there's also some other questions in the room, maybe? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you knew from the museum research you did, if we have the indication that each perfume vessel, for instance, was actually used. So you mentioned residue analysis, for instance. Could it be that sometimes those really decorative glass perfume would be interpreted as such, but actually would actually have never been used and placed in a funerary context, for instance?
Thank you. Yeah, one of the really interesting things is from what we can tell, it's not always very clear of whether they've been used at all, just because any like residue flakes off or washes off. So who knows? But the current theory is that they're reusable, that they would be taken back and refilled, and then you would use them and taken back and refilled. So the nicer it is doesn't necessarily mean it's used less. You know, it's less disposable, really. And so it might be like a family heirloom of, you know, you fill it up because these are being traded in such large quantities and they can be mixed up. And then, you know, people come back with their little glass vessels and get a little bit. So yeah, one of the first zero waste shops, I guess.
Any more questions in the room? I'm coming to you.
Hello. What I wanted to ask is, I'm sure that when I was in Egypt, they actually had on it was the pink quartz, and I'm not sure rock salts sort of vessels as well for perfumery in a smaller sense, but we have little table ones compared to the bigger ones. Is that quite commonly found as well? No, the other materials like quartz as a vessel. Yeah, I'm sure it was quartz or rock salts that was used, which I came across.
Thank you. Yeah, I must admit I've never come across that from the Bronze Age, at least. So we've got alabaster quite frequently and glass, but I think, I don't know whether, you know, like pink quartz, it's probably not as porous, but any of the rock types that they tried, it's so porous that the scents don't kind of like aren't contained. And that's the kind of main difference. It's why I'm not looking at perfumes. I kind of look at scent dissemination. And with perfume vessels, the idea is to contain the scent so much that you kind of don't move away from the tried and tested methods that they've got. I personally also don't know how much access they've got to, you know, large amounts of quartz. I know they have like little bits of it, but I don't know whether they would mine it at all. So I would be really interested to know if anybody else knows of that.
Because you mentioned mostly resins, did they actually use flowers like they do now in perfumery?
And back again. I'm getting my steps in.
Yeah, 100%. That is mainly what the perfumes are used in, particularly in the Old Kingdom. That's, they've got, you know, a lot of like different flowers and petals. And the one thing that my PhD is on is the larger tree resins. which is why I kind of focus on like that later period, where they're kind of like running a bit more back and forth. But yeah, 100% they're using flowers in their perfumes. It's kind of the main thing. We do have quite a few like actual full, especially from the late period, lists of perfume recipes, and they all use flowers. Or not, I'm not sure every single one, but the majority do. And we've also, for Babylon, however, we've got the perfume text at Lhasa, which is in Egyptological terms, it's around the Middle Kingdom, like early Middle Kingdom. They are, what they do is they kind of steep these ingredients in the oil, and so that includes woods, leaves, as well as flowers. That answers that.
Well, that answered one of my questions at least. Valentina, do we have online questions?
Yes, there's one question. Could the visual aspect of perfumes point to a different market, for instance, domestic, female, to cover bad smell, and tampon use could be classed more as incense, as into perfume the environment / create a subliminal space?
Yeah, that's it's a really good question. It's a very confusing answer. So you get these perfumes, but it's the difference between, are people using them as perfumes or are people using them as anointing? And because you get this like ancestor veneration worship at home, theoretically, technically, it's, if you see them in domestic contexts, does that mean they're not religious at all? And yeah, so iconographically, it's very, like, I haven't come over many, apart from the whole like banquet scenes and kind of those scenes, I haven't seen the use of perfumes in a solely domestic context, like cut apart from any religious contexts. I don't know whether any exist. They might do. But yeah, that is the extent of my research. I will continue and follow up if I have any follow-ups, really.
Well, okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Valentina, online?
Any more questions? But thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. Thank you.
Well, I can just squeeze one in. Particularly recently, not too many, a couple of years ago, there was a burial found in Amarna with a head cone. So do you have any comments on that versus perfume use?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the ones that I was reading up recently, actually yesterday. There's a 2012 PhD which was published about the head cones. And they're like, no, they're only theoretical. It's only theoretical. And then 2013 was when the first one was found. And it was like, oh, that's bad timing. It's one of the things, so all of the analyses done on those, so there have been two found in Amarna, one in 2013, one in 2015. Any perfume that was in there has now gone. It's only beeswax. But what's kind of like inside is it's kind of like a wad of textile coated in beeswax. So it's whether, you know, the wad of textile could have been scented and then they put the beeswax over. Or, so both of these have been found in kind of like young female burials. It's whether they're just models and it is, you know, a whole theoretical in life, but present as a model in death, as it is iconographically. And they're not actually used in daily life. That's also another quite prevalent theory. I tried to avoid it because, but I think they could be used in daily life. And I think if they are used in daily life, they're likely to be perfumed, but I'm not sure whether they would have used like straight up resin or whether they would have used these kind of like these fats mixed with the flowers, kind of these perfumes, and then put that in the textile and coated it. That seems the most reasonable to me.
I'll let you go with that one, I think. There's one last comment.
Sorry. Talking about perfumes, in some cultures you have like sort of necklaces that have got little holes where you can put some sort of like a tissue or something that's impregnated with perfume. Do they have some kind of jewelry that they carried around that gave them personal perfume that they wore?
Well, I know those were used for incantations at least, but
Yeah, I must admit, never looked at that, so I'm not entirely sure. The whole idea about the incense cones comes from other African cultures with they put like tallow on their heads, and that was kind of like where those ideas come from. So it's definitely not beyond the realm of possibility that these kind of ideas are still carried on today, and especially, as you say, they're used for incantations and things like that. So yeah, sorry, my knowledge is not too great today.
had some brilliant and very difficult questions today, so you're excused. Thank you very much, Catherine. That was a really brilliant presentation.